our last virtual Women in Platforms. It's been an amazing run. Thanks again, Gillian, for suggesting that we do this. Gillian, Rose, and I have been really delighted with the response and had loved the sessions. I was telling Hannah about an hour ago, I was like, oh, I just need to go lie in a dark room. And she's like, don't worry, because we have Women in Platforms coming in. We're always so energized afterwards. And it's been great to have this every Wednesday to look forward to. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's session with Susan Freeman. So Susan was meant to, and I'm going to lapse into calling her Susie because we've known each other for I think over 20 or about 20 years when we were both working in Boston
at 12 years of age.
Exactly. My hair color was different, as Susan was revealing earlier. But Susan was meant to join us a few weeks ago when we took a break to support the Talk About Black sessions. I'm really pleased we were able to get you back in. Thank you, because I know you're super busy with your business. Susan is founder and CEO of Freeman Means Business, and that is a company, which Susan might correct me after, dedicated to conscious inclusion through effective communication. Susan has taught me a lot over the last 2 decades. I can't believe it's that long, about networking, sales, the importance of having a good laugh with my girlfriends, but also about communicating clearly and being really clear about what I'm trying to get out of something and making sure that I'm communicating in a way that will be clear to the person I'm speaking with, not just to me. So I'm really, really happy to welcome you today, Susan. So Susan, I think you have some slides to share with us. And just housekeeping note, we're recording this because we're starting to make these sessions available after. So we're recording it just in case that affects the questions you want to ask afterwards. You can also put them through the chat anonymously. And so we'll do the usual format with presentation and then some discussion afterwards. Susan, can I pass over to you?
Sure. Thank you, Heather. So it's really funny for me to hear you call me Susan, but I'll share in my presentation a funny story about how I went from Susie to Susan. And it was during the time in my life when Heather and I were closest, and we were working in the same city. And you'll just get a big kick out of this story because it plays right into the things that I teach today. So I have a couple of companies. They all fall under the umbrella of conscious inclusion. And I like that phrase. And I named my company the Conscious Inclusion Company because we all too often fall on the catch-all of unconscious bias. And we say, whether conscious or not, we say, oh, it's unconscious. Everyone does it. And it's sort of a psychological permission slip to just continue being the way we are and communicating the way we do. But when you focus on conscious inclusion, you are proactively taking measures to include others, not just focusing on diversity or checking the boxes, because diversity is what we know. It's the quantitative data. It's how many women or how many people of color, etc. But inclusivity is actually the more difficult concept, and they are two different concepts. It's a much more difficult concept to focus on inclusivity, and that is what we do. So right there is the difference, is the knowing-doing gap, right? So diversity is what we know, inclusivity is what we do. We're trying to close that gap. With that, I always focus on starting with communications because that is the foundation of concrete, if you're effective in your communications, that all the houses of D&I are built. If you are not effective in your communications, your DEI house is built on a block of ice, and when that ice melts, everything crumbles. So that's why I make the case that communications is key, regardless of what your job or role or the things you enjoy doing for fun, the things you do for money. Communication is key. And I will remind you all before we launch into the presentation that the receiver makes meaning of the message regardless of the sender's intent. As much as we try to communicate effectively, for example, my husband is a political official and he often gives speeches. And one day he came home and he said, wow, I think I'm a great communicator. I said, well, that's awesome, honey. Why do you think that? And he said, well, there were 300 some odd people in the room. I got a standing ovation. It was really great. I said, so how, what makes you think you're a good communicator versus a great public speaker? And he said, I never thought about that. I didn't realize there was a difference. So the difference is communication takes place when you get confirmation from your audience that they've understood the message as you intended it when you sent it. So if you remember nothing else from today's session, remember that regardless of your intent, the receiver makes meaning of the message. All right, so I'm going to stop the video and share my slides. Gender differences in communications. Now, I know I sent a little blurb about this before. I want to make it clear that these are not genetic differences. These are essences and nuances of how we communicate differently that were detected by the grandmother of all gendered communications, Dr. Deborah Tannen. She's a linguistics professor. I actually know her. She's a shero of mine. She's a linguistics professor at Georgetown University who many books ago and many New York Times columns ago and many years ago, because she must be nearing 80 or in her 80s now, started some research on how boys and girls communicate differently on the playground. And then she tracked gendered behaviors and communication styles into the boardroom. So a lot of the work that I do is based on her work. It includes her proteges such as Amy Cuddy and others. So you'll get a kick out of this presentation, and I'll give you some great tips and tricks and tools that you can take away. But this is a fun presentation with some serious topic, right? So the topic is serious, but we're going to have fun learning it. I like to say that I am edutaining you. And I laugh at my own jokes as well. So in the original blurb about this session, I said, it's been said that men and women are different, and they're so different that they must come from different planets. Many of you know Dr. John Gray and his work in Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. It's a cheeky, silly title to a book that has some very serious and very good information. We all know that even though his book was very popular and he probably made millions and millions of dollars as the self-therapist, the self-improvement book therapist at home, it's true that we do communicate differently. It's true that we're from the same planet, Earth, but we do communicate differently. So let's look at how that plays out. First of all, I want to speak to a little bit of the research that we use in my work. I work a lot with Catalyst. They do international research on all things DEI, not just gender communications, but LGBTQ and people of color, and where women of color fall in the workforce inequalities and such. This piece, however, is from McKinsey. You're all very familiar with McKinsey. Each year they partner with Lean In. I live in Silicon Valley in South San Francisco, California is the beginning of Silicon Valley. I'm in the world's largest biotech cluster. And Sheryl Sandberg of Lean In is not far from me. She's right down the road in Palo Alto. She and her organization, leanin.org, participate annually with McKinsey in this Women in the Workplace report. And for the past 6 years, they've done this, and I've seen no progress for women entering the workforce until 2019. In 2019, we finally found some parity where women and men entered the workforce at the same rate. However, we found that they're not able to move into management for whatever reason, and we know the reason. I'm going to tell you the reason. But in the studies, it shows that they're calling it a missing rung on the ladder, the corporate ladder. I call it the broken rung. I think the rung is there, but women are denied these opportunities. And I'll make the case that it's because we communicate differently. Companies need to focus on where this real problem is. The obstacle that women face is much earlier than the pipeline. We finally can track that data. Now, this particular report has to do with the United States. In the rest of my presentation, there'll be some data that's global. So a recent report by NPR shows that women outnumber men on the payrolls. Perhaps this will mean the growing number of women in the workplace is likely to reshape the demand for things that women tend to care about, think about, and put in corporate governance and bylaws and missions, visions, and strategies, such as paid family leave, or flexible hours. Men might appreciate that as well, but those aren't generally uh, priorities or considerations in our history of creating operating systems across the globe. If you think about it, it makes sense. I do a lot of teaching on muted group theory. My background is communications theory. So when I talk about muted group theory, it refers to how the operating systems across the globe were created by men. And when you understand how men and women communicate differently, you'll understand that that's why women and other minorities struggle to navigate within those operating systems. Ways of leadership, ways of promotion, ways of recruitment are all in the language of white males. And those of us who are not white male don't speak that, and we are not recognized in the language that we speak. And this is not a slam to white males. Just think about it as people who speak French and people who speak Italian. Both are valid languages, but if you don't know the other person's language, communication doesn't take place. And a person who's hiring who speaks Italian is more likely to connect better with, bond with, and promote someone who speaks their language. Women are less likely to be hired and promoted to manager. For every 100 men promoted, there are only 72 who are promoted and hired. And the case for women of color is far worse. A woman of color in my same position, with my same background experience, same or similar reviews and positive reviews, will make a third of what I make. It's not okay. Men hold 62% of manager level positions, while women hold only 38%. 1/3 of companies set gender representation targets for a first level manager role, compared to 41% for senior levels of management. So these are, again, stats from the US. Throughout the presentation, I will share stats that are global. So what is the purpose of communication? Now, I gave you a big hint before we started the presentation, and I talked a little bit about Dr. Deborah Tannen, but let me just speak a little more in detail. Growing up, boys and girls are often segregated, restricting them to socialize solely with individuals of their own gender. And this is before they can even identify as such, because we label them at birth. Learning a distinct culture as well as their own gender norms. Now, Dr. Tannen calls them gender norms, and you'll see why in a moment. This results in differences in communications between men and women as they grow older, inclining both genders to communicate for contrasting reasons. Think about it. So men on the call, you're probably more likely to communicate as a way to maintain independence and status, while women, you know, tend to view communication as a path to collaborate, create friendships, build relationships. For men, communication is a way to negotiate power and seek wins, to avoid failure and offer advice, among other things. But for women, communication is often a way to get closer, to seek understanding, to find equality or symmetry. Much of this communication takes place in nonverbal ways. As we know, more than, I'd say nowadays, we've recognized more than 70%, maybe 80% of communication is nonverbal. So the struggle is real. Now, this is not Donald Trump on your screen. This is just, this could be my husband, actually. So I tell this story when this slide comes up about when I worked at State Street in Boston. And when I worked at State Street, I noticed that the women, the very few women who were successful there, and this is back in the 90s, so let me qualify with that, that the women dressed like men, acted like men, behaved as men, led like men, treated other women as the men treated other women versus as women generally treat women. And one might say, what's wrong with that? Well, when you learn more about muted group theory and how in the 90s studies showed that women had to mimic the men in order to gain what they considered success, a slight promotion, a bonus that might be half of the bonus that their equal, who was a male, had received. The struggle was real, and the struggle remains real. And I have this picture up here because even the narrow limits of a professional man's wardrobe, like dark suits, pale shirts, allow him a degree of freedom, because uniformity resists cultural labeling, or marking as we call it. I, on the other hand, at State Street, and I did not put this picture in here, but I should share it with you someday. I have a picture of me from when I worked there. I was in my 20s, but I did quite well. I was a VP making great money, but I had big hair. So one of those two senior women came to me and gave me some unsolicited advice. And she said to me, you know, if you want to succeed here in financial services in Boston, you really should lose the big hair. And I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. And frankly, I was like, what is big hair? What do you mean big hair? And frankly, looking back in the 80s, we all know what big hair is now. But I had jewelry, I had makeup, I wore colorful suits, and I wore some really great high heel pumps that Heather may recall. However, she said to me, let's go to Talbot's and buy you some black, brown, gray, and navy blue pantsuits and some low block heeled pumps. Let's lose the makeup of the hair and the jewelry. And I was highly offended, but then, you know, I was young. So I did as I was told. And in some ways, it helped me to be successful. But the real kicker was, she said, if you want to be taken seriously in financial services in Boston, and this is before the crash, so things were really going along swimmingly. She said, you're going to have to change your name from Susie to Susan. Now, my birth name is Susan, but all my life people had called me Susie, which is why Heather calls me Susie. But I was shocked. I was like horrified. I think today a company would be sued. And in defense of State Street, they have done a remarkable job of becoming inclusive and focusing on success for women and fairness, and you know, but this is back in the 90s, so don't forget. So that's where the name came in. The multiple choices a woman faces in her clothing, like hairstyle, as mentioned, makeup, etc., they leave us more vulnerable to being categorized, or as I mentioned earlier, marked. Female professionals often speak tentatively to soften any emotional blow of the message they're delivering. Men often see this way of speaking as a sign of insecurity, or worse, incompetence. Now, we know that's not true. It does not make you insecure. It does not make you incompetent if you speak softly and tentatively. I'm just telling you how the receiver is making meaning of that message if the receiver is a man. I find that the failure to communicate in both spoken words and ritual communications leads to a disconnect, and is part of the reason why women aren't being promoted at the rate that men are, and aren't being recognized for the skills and the abilities that we bring to the table. Spoken words like apologies and compliments, these are both called ritual communications. The words "I'm sorry" can either be a ritual expression of sympathy or the first step in restoring emotional balance. That's how women use this phrase. And I'm sure you've read many articles saying, women, stop apologizing. Well, I'm going to be a little provocative here and say, you know what, women, we apologize in many different ways that men apologize. And I say, stop some of those ways, but not all of those ways. Let's take this for example. Bob will apologize when Bob is to blame for something. And studies show men rarely apologize, but when they do, it's to take blame. That's it. But women might apologize in order to level set the team, or to distribute the disappointment fairly among all who worked on a project. Maybe the client didn't accept the project, and the team leader might say, I'm sorry, this didn't work out. Let's start over, or let's move on to the next client. She's not apologizing because she's to blame, but because in a man's brain, he apologizes when he is to blame. When he hears her say these words, he subconsciously registers, what did she do wrong? Or where did this team leader mess up such that the project wasn't accepted by the client? Another example is, for example, when women say, I'm sorry, to save face, right? So we help to establish some sense of emotional well-being among everyone on the team. When a woman apologizes, male colleagues might assume she is to blame for something when really she's not. When we say, I'm sorry your Uncle Joe died, we're not saying that I'm to blame for his death. We're just trying to show emotional support. Men do that too as well. Compliments is another ritual practice. You'll see women walk down the hall say, oh, I love the new shoes, or your haircut looks nice, or where did you get that sweater? I've got to get one like that. You don't often hear men engaging in those ritual compliments, ritual communications known as compliments. Words matter. Now, this is research from all over the globe based on LinkedIn, right? LinkedIn's work. They do a lot of great research in the gendered area, in the recruitment area. Men and women favor different words to describe their work experience, and they express themselves even if at a similar seniority level. For example, the language men and women use to represent their experience varies. They might say, let's say, men and women use positive, strong, performance-based descriptors like hardworking. So that we both use those phrases about the same or similar rates. 58% of women use that phrase, 49% of men use that phrase. The phrase good at my job, 48% of women use that phrase, 42% of men use that phrase. The word confident, we almost use that word equally. 42% of women use the word confident and 40% of men. Women, however, also prioritize terms that relate to our personal characteristics to describe ourselves. Let's say, for example, and men rarely do this, if ever. Things like likable. 38% of women use that phrase, under 20% of men. Supportive. 39% of women use that phrase, under 30% of men. So I think that one can conclude that men focus on their strengths and skills, whereas women may focus on their strengths and skills, but also their personal characteristics. You know, I'm likable, which I'm not saying we need to change that. These are just facts, right? This is just information. What I agree that we need to change is the operating system within which we all work. I don't think that women need to change who they are, how they are. Of course, there are certain exceptions, but I do think that men need to understand that we simply speak a different language, and because men are still in power, they need more than anyone to understand why the operating system needs to be more inclusive of others, women and other minorities. There are gender differences even in our nonverbal cues. Amy Cuddy's work is about this. You've heard of the power pose. You've heard of how women and men sit a certain way. You don't see a woman with her feet spread shoulder width apart in a skirt on stage giving a talk, right? But you'll often see a man in his suit, his feet shoulder width apart on stage giving a talk. So that's just one example. Women tend to keep their feet waist, like their hips, right? The width of their hips. They keep their feet about that distance. So those are just some small examples about nonverbal cues. Let's look at facial expressions. Nonverbal communication is integral to how we communicate, but each gender uses different nonverbal cues when communicating. Our faces can demonstrate more than 10,000 facial expressions. But men overall use fewer facial expressions than women. Men also smile less. And again, I'm not asking women to stop smiling, but I am telling you that studies show when you're seen as friendly, and look, ask Heather, because I was the friendliest person that ever worked at State Street. And sometimes people confuse friendly with incompetent, or friendly with a knowing or junior position, or, you know, so if you're kind or you smile too much, you get penalized, right? And if you don't smile and you're trying to make sure that you're playing a more serious role, men often say, you know, smile, you know, Susan, what's wrong? We're often being told to smile. So it's almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. So we need to focus on things like facial expressions. Women tend to rely heavily on them. We nod, we engage in eye contact more than men do. Men don't nod as much. They don't engage in eye contact. They don't communicate with their bodies as much as women do. There are reasons for that. We'll talk a little bit more about what's called paralanguage. It's defined as the non-lexical component of communication by speech. For example, intonation, pitch, speed of speaking, hesitation noises, gesture, and facial expressions. Paralanguage is used by women much more than men. This includes gesturing noises such as ah, oh, as well as head nodding. These gestures are a way to convey, I'm listening, I'm with you, I understand what you're saying, without actually saying those words. Women also engage in what Deborah Tannen calls overlapping. It's not the same as interrupting. If Heather and I are engaged in an active conversation and we're very excited about what we're talking about, I might say, oh yeah, I was there with you, while she's still talking. That's to validate and support and show enthusiasm and express positivity. It's not like an interruption that a man-interrupter is what I call them, might at a business meeting cut Heather off and while she's expressing an idea and maybe change topic or even take her idea. So note those differences. Men also use paralanguage during communication, but they do so far less frequently. And it's usually just to confirm someone's comment or to, without using the word, say, I agree. Let's look at physical space. Men are much more likely to command and use their personal space than women. Men often prefer face-to-face communication with the opportunity to shake hands, although now in coronavirus and COVID-19, we can't do that anymore, or to pat someone's shoulder. But women are usually comfortable speaking with someone side by side or face-to-face and are more comfortable being in much closer proximity than men. We hug, we rub, we might rub someone's arm. Now, all this has to change because of COVID-19, but think about the unique difference in how men take up their power space. A woman would never kick back like that in a meeting, right? So let's say this guy has a team member in his office. He might kick back like that. I don't think a woman would ever do that. Or rarely would do that. All these are, they're not meaningless platitudes. They're based on research and they do show the majority of the time, the essences of the differences. There are certain women who might do that. I don't know them, but I'm sure they're out there. But let's take note on how men engage totally differently in an extremely personal relationship. So when engaged in a relationship, say you're dating or married, or this is your spouse or girlfriend, a man might want to sit next to her and watch a movie, or sit next to her at the movies, or sit next to her in the booth at a restaurant. But a woman wants to read his face, look in his eyes, see his expressions, and sit across from him to do so. But in those kinds of personal relationships, men see someone sitting across from them as not as connected, as an adversary, someone on the other side. They sort of get a defense up. Oftentimes, men will say, come sit next to me and we'll have dinner. And the woman will say, well, I'd like to sit across from you so that I can read your, communications, even outside of your words. What about touch? That's a huge, very powerful form of communication that we are all going to struggle with in this COVID-19 pre-vaccine landscape, because we are so used to touch, especially women. While there are some differences in how men and women communicate through physical touch, there are many similarities because of our genetic makeup. Usually men, like I said, use pats on the back slaps, shoulder touches as a way to display dominance and connection, while men use an introductory handshake to set the tone for communication that's about to take place. You're engaging in a nonverbal contract when you shake hands, and you're letting this person know we're about to embark on a conversation that's meaningful. Women, on the other hand, may reach out and touch someone's arm or offer a hug to build a connection and show support, to lift others up. Researchers show that this touch, and we all know this, releases oxytocin in our brains, and it connects us in a more meaningful and memorable way. What about posture? I talked a little bit about how men on stage might stand, with their feet shoulder width apart. Women would generally stand with their feet hip width apart. Men typically have wider postures and stand with their arms farther away from their bodies. Women are more likely to keep their arms closer to their bodies and even cross their legs at the ankles or when sitting at the ankles or knees. What about gestures? According to research on nonverbal communication, women learn during childhood to align their bodies to face the other person, which is a lot of what I was saying about going to dinner with your spouse or your partner. You sit across from them so that you can assess their communications that are nonverbal. Women's gestures are also typically more fluid. We move a lot more. Do you notice that? Men, meanwhile, use sharper, more directed movements. And then there's eye contact. We all know the power of eye contact. That's a message you send that, again, remember, the receiver makes meaning of that message. Women typically use more direct eye contact during communication in order to make a strong connection, to develop a relationship, and to sort of read, and I'm using air quotes, read the person. Men, however, use eye contact mostly commonly as a challenge, and this is in a business relationship, as a challenge of power or position. Look them directly in the eye. I was on debate team. We did that a lot. So how do we overcome differences? And when I say that, I'm talking about not change who we are as people, but understand the other person's perspective. Listen with empathy and not judgment. Understand where they're coming from, not just, gender-wise, but the histories we all bring to the table. The more we tell compelling stories, always backed by data, then the more we get to know the other person, and we can communicate effectively with them, knowing their position from which they operate. The communication process is very complex, and adding the gender differences into the mix only complicates it more. However, it doesn't mean we can't better understand how we ourselves communicate and give some space for the other person to communicate the way that they do. So in our discussion, I thought I might ask, how does gender affect the goals that you set? I know that in my classes at Cornell, we talk a lot about how women work harder to make it to the top, and in part, it's because we know our journey is going to be fraught with potholes and roadblocks. This is why I do what I do, is to eliminate the potholes and the roadblocks, not to change who men are and who women are. So do you feel your motivators are related to your gender? Have you felt limited by gender stereotypes or bias in setting your goals? And have you felt empowered to set ambitious goals as women entrepreneurs or women in business, I should say? And that would be it for the slides. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Susan, sorry.
Either way.
I'm gonna have to go with Susie. Do you mind turning off sharing screen, and then we can all
Sure.
Chat? Great, that was absolutely fantastic, and I have so many new terms. Shiro, I'd never heard of muted gap theory. Manterrupter, never heard of that before.
I have a lot of great stuff for any of you who want to know any of these terms. I have resources I can share, questions that I can answer. You're one of my Shiros, Heather.
Likewise, and I do remember your shoes. There's been a huge amount of chat in the chat, but I'm gonna ask the first thing. So you've provided those 3 prompts, but before we get to those, can we just pick up a couple of things that came up in the chat, and also a question that I had. So, I think one of the things you do, and I think it'd be really interesting to talk a little bit about what you do, because in the workshops you're running, I think there's this challenge of trying to make progress on diversity and inclusion is an area of frustration for a lot of people. And the good thing is at least in the UK, it seems to be driven from a good governance perspective. So the perspective is that a firm that's well run and well managed and well governed will have a diverse workforce, and you will see diverse candidates progressing within the organization. I don't know if the same is true in the US, but it doesn't seem to be just about.
Not.
Yeah, I didn't think it was. And do you want to, well, actually, can you talk a little bit about what's driving the desire for diversity and inclusion, or the move to diversity and inclusion in the US?
Oh, that's such a great question, especially in light of recent terrible tragic events and those who have. Look, we've had these tragedies time and time again. It's much like mass shootings. This country gets all excited for 15 minutes, and then they're like, "Oh, look, something shiny," and they get distracted, and then there goes this meaningful advocacy for a cause that should be focused on, but then goes forgotten, right? So the same thing has happened. We've had countless number. We had a female Black police officer who was in her home, sleeping in her bed, off duty, where police officers entered her home and she ended up dead. It was a mistake in the address. They were sent to the wrong address. There's no excuse for that, but they got off. Our police unions are so powerful here. And I'm not saying all cops are bad. Look, my husband runs a city, the police work for him. They're not all bad, but it depends on who you hire, how you recruit, what type of person you want on your force. If you comb through your corporate communications and you find there's a lot of communication that's biased or even bigoted, you shouldn't have that person on your force. If you comb through their social media before you hire, you shouldn't hire those people. This country has faced so much in the way of the most powerful lobby here, the NRA. They own and operate our Congress members. They create their own legislation, and the Congress member just signs it and passes it around for other signatures. That's what Citizens United has done to this country. Don't get me going on that because that's a whole nother session. But I will say that this country has faced a problem of systemic racism and institutional inequalities that I would link back to muted group theory. If you study muted group theory, it does explain that it's not the white man's fault. It's simply that because of our history, white men had the power to create companies and to create governance and to create the rules by which we operate, the laws under which we operate. So everything you read, see, hear, feel, believe, act upon is a product of the language of the white male. And those of us who aren't white males don't speak that language. And so let's use this for example. The problem in corporate America, to address your question, might be one example is Heather is at XYZ company leading a team meeting, and she's finally come up with the solution to a problem that her client has faced for months and couldn't pinpoint a solution for. And Heather has been up night after night for a month now, wondering, how can I solve this problem before it happens or gets worse? She brings this solution to her team and says, team, I think I have the answers. Please review this report or this, solution that I've come up with. Tell me where the knowing doing gap is. Tell me where I've made mistakes. Tell me if I've missed anything. What do you see? I'm seeking your feedback. But Bob, Heather's boss, who's also in the meeting, sees Heather requesting feedback and input from others, regardless of their pay grade or title. And Bob says, wow, Heather is insecure. She's seeking validation. She needs input from others. She can't delegate and direct. I don't think Heather's ready for a promotion or a pay raise. Bob doesn't express this to Heather, even in her evaluation. He just doesn't think she's appropriate for the higher position or the better pay. When in reality, Heather was engaging in what we call transformational leadership, which is much like what you do with your clients when you ask questions, assess needs, and then you build a solution around their feedback. Feedback is a sign of respect, whether positive or negative. And Heather was appropriately seeking feedback from all of her team members, because guess what? Diverse perspectives bring in innovative solutions, creativity. So to have diverse perspectives from people of all color, from various genders, those who don't identify as either gender, whatever the spectrum might be, to gather feedback is very progressive. And when you do that, you increase your bottom line by 19%, having people like Heather in management positions. But people like Bob, who are old school and have been at the company for many, many years, might say, that's not what leadership looks like, because Bob was raised in a generation or many generations of hierarchical leadership versus transformational leadership. We know through Yale Institute on Emotional Intelligence, Dr. Mark Brackett's work, He's one of my partners actually in some of the work that I do. His work on permission to feel, and Daniel Goleman with the emotional intelligence. We know that's what leadership looks like today, to include a lot of EQ, feedback from others, transformational leadership. Those are the people who need to be promoted into management and into the C-suite. And in this country, we don't see that. And I'm going to give you an example, and I hope that this doesn't, I hope no one from this, well, I'll just say XYZ company in case someone on the call is from this global company. But there's a global company with 385,000 employees. They have an office in almost every major city in America. And one of those cities is Seattle. They have 3,000 people who work in the Seattle office. And after the George Floyd incident, which has prompted a lot of companies to engage in some way, either meaningfully or just as a PR stunt, this company was one of those that engaged in this way. And you tell me, Heather, if this is meaningful or if this is a PR stunt. This company has 3,000 employees in their Seattle office. Only 3 of them are Black. Out of 3,000, 3 of them are Black. Only one of those Black people is a partner at this company. And this is a global accounting firm. I'll just put it that way. The thing that they did after the George Floyd incident was cut a check for $5 million US, donated that check to a social justice association in America, and then had their director of communications create a really snazzy, shiny statement for their website. Now, one of my best friends and one of the faculty members at my company is one of the 3 Black people there. Let me ask you, was that move meaningful? Did it impact policies, plans, pay, pipeline, practices at this company? Or was it a PR stunt?
Yeah, no, I think the answer is probably obvious to everyone on the call, because it has to be in combination with so much more.
Exactly. My friend marched into the senior level person's office in Seattle and said, "How does that help me?" And that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's what we're finding in this country. And we are actually, companies like mine are looking at companies who are cutting these checks to Black Lives Matter, but then not looking internally at their own systemic racism or institutional inequities, and they're not making any progress or change to change that white male operating system. And again, I'm not blaming white males. When I do my session, many men over 50 come up to me after and say, "Thank you for explaining how we got to where we are without throwing me under the bus. I'm so afraid to even speak up after. Since hashtag Me Too movement, I've been quiet," right? What I tell them is, now we know why we got here. It's a reason, not an excuse. So let's take the tools that we provide you to move us to where we need to be. And we all know research shows that a more diverse and inclusive team makes for more innovative, creative ideas.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I want to come to Helena, if you don't mind, because I thought you asked a really interesting question in the chat about regional differences and how this transcends different cultures. Are you happy to ask?
Absolutely, that's a
Oh,
great.
hang on, Susie. Sorry, Helena's just going to ask the give a bit more context on the question.
Oh, I see it in the chat. Okay.
Helena, do you?
I just thought it's to me it's more than gender in terms of diversity, because it's about cultural differences as well. How we bring up shapes a lot of our beliefs. And if you look at the world now, it's so much. I'm South African, so I'm often told I'm really direct. And it's just sort of interesting to see how people just put you in a box based on where you come from sometimes. So I just wonder how that sort of fits into what you do, because if you're looking at how people communicate differently, how does that fit? Even if you look at England, and I'm sorry if I get this wrong because I often do, but the North and the South, you always get things that's culturally different. One drinks tea from Yorkshire tea or something, and I just never get it. It's always quite funny to me. So it's just interesting to see that it's not just from different countries, but also within a country, different regions, people behave differently and are brought up differently. And how does that impact on their how they communicate?
That's a really great question. And I have a session that I do that it's a much bigger, broader session. It includes workshop. And we do talk about regional differences. And this is why I start and end every session with the receiver makes meaning of the message. So one of the examples I use in that session that we're talking beyond gender differences. We're talking about all communications differences. I use a slide that, if you don't mind, Heather, I'd love to pull it up if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so that is such a great question. And I have difficulty talking and typing at the same time. So just let me pull this slide up really quickly. I think you'll very much appreciate it. Bear with me one second.
Take your time, take your time.
And we talk about ambiguity, and that's a really, I'm so glad you brought that up. And I'll use State Street as an example again. All right, now if you let me share screen.
Can you not?
There we go. So this was me at State Street.
That's the Susie I know.
Yeah. So let me quickly get to that slide. That was me at State Street when they said, comb that hair. And I was like, what hair? What's wrong with my hair? That's not big hair. That's just me from the South, right? And I spoke with a little bit of a twang, which I think you probably will tell me I'm a liar if I say I don't have it anymore. But I had the big Southern girl look, if you will. That's cultural and regional, and that's how we roll down there. I had lots of, you know, those were red nails in that black and white picture. And my argument to them was, well, wait a minute. How is it that I won't be successful with big hair, makeup, red nails, and all the jewelry and the bling if this woman is? And so I showed that this was my shero at the time. I'm like, if Oprah can do it, I can do it too. And they said to me, Oprah doesn't work here, right? So I clearly understood the message. Now I'm going to get to a slide that I want to show you. This slide. What do you see in that slide, Heather and team?
I saw a bird.
All right. Anyone else see something else?
The slides disappeared though.
Yep, that's on purpose.
Oh, Amira sees duck and hare.
A duck. Yeah, a duck.
I saw a hare and a duck.
Martin sees bunny. Oh no, he's on the screen.
So someone sees a bunny and someone sees a duck?
Bunny.
Someone sees a bunny and someone sees a duck.
Yeah.
When I get lawyers in the room, they make the case for the duck or make the case for the bunny. The fact is, it's both. And we talk about ambiguity. And then I go into regional and cultural differences. And I talk about how my time at State Street, I used to call, when I worked at Boston Financial Data Services, the transfer agent at the time for State Street, I used to call Jay Hooley, who was then the president of BFDS. I used to call him Mr. Hooley. And we both moved into State Street, the parent company, together, and he became the CEO of State Street. But back then he said to me, Susan, if you call me Mr. Hooley one more time, you'll forever be relegated as the get me a cup of coffee girl. So I'm from Louisiana, and you better bet your bottom dollar you're going to call somebody who's a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, or billion in that case, you're going to call them Mr. So-and-so, right? If you're in New Orleans, Louisiana, or Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they use Miss, Mr., ma'am, sir a lot, right? But if you're in Boston, you will never be seen as a trusted advisor and equal, someone who could bring something of value in exchange for money or whatever that other piece of the puzzle is. So that is what we do go into that, Helena, about how in Boston, even in our same country, I would call, and when I did move to State Street, people would hear me call him Jay, and, you know, we were friends, and he, you know, so it was Jay and Susan. No longer was it Susie and Mr. Hooley. So that's a perfectly great question. I want to show you a couple of examples. In my notes, I have these examples. Another cultural, regional difference might be showing generosity. As you know, Southern people in this country are known as having Southern hospitality. So if I'm given a corporate card by State Street and I throw it on the table after we bring clients out and Heather's with me and I say, oh, I got this. Heather, who might be from a different part of the world, would say, oh, look at her, she's a show off, she's going to cover the bill and think she looks good. When I'm from the South and we love to take care of everybody and I'm just being hospitable and thinking I'm being generous, right? So we call that projection. So again, remember, the biggest lesson here today is the receiver makes meaning of the message. In this case, Heather is the receiver and she thinks that I'm being a cocky mofo because I'm paying the bill, when really I'm just being generous, sweet, Southern, charming girl that I am, right? So that's another example of regional and different cultural communication. So remember ambiguous behaviors. Another example that I'm sure you all face, when somebody offers you help unsolicitedly, or if you send a document or you create a website and they offer you advice or input, or maybe you should change the font to this, or maybe you should eliminate that sentence, and you did not ask them for help, we have a general tendency to say, who the hell does she think she is? I didn't ask her. When really that person might be an expert in that area. And you might say, oh, I really appreciate your input, but here's why I did it this way. Or maybe you feel like you shouldn't have to explain yourself and say, you know, screw off, this is my business, I know what I'm doing, I didn't ask you. Again, regional, cultural, lots of different communication styles. And you can now see why I purposely show the slide and then quickly go to the black slide so that you can think about it. I don't want you to study this picture because we don't get the chance in communication to study what the other person said. In fact, I tell people, use the tool of curiosity. Slow down your rate of speech. You don't have to immediately reply. You don't have to wait till they hit the, second to last word of their sentence to jump in. Stop. Create what we call the emphatic pause. It will make that person lean in and listen more intently to what you're about to say. And when you do that, say to yourself, that's curious. And use those two words in your head, the time it takes for you to tell yourself, that's curious. Creates the emphatic pause, and it gives you time to process the true meaning of what that statement was before you reply. We've all heard the phrase of oftentimes people, when they're speaking to one another, they're just waiting to talk over, waiting for the person to finish so they can make their next point. That is not effective communication.
Susie, at the risk of cutting you off and interjecting, do you mind turning off screen share so I can just see if there's any last comments or questions, because we have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Any questions? No. So I think that's a really good tip or suggestion to end on. And the thing I've really liked about your take on this is that it moves on a long way from where we both started in our career, where Susie and I there was a contributor handbook, and there was strict rules about how it was for both men and women about how we had to dress. And I know, Sam, you mentioned in the comments that you had something similar at Towers Perrin when you were working in New York, and I absolutely hated Talbots. Absolutely.
Yeah, at the time it was all black, gray, brown, no red, pink, no yellow, no orange. We also in that handbook, Heather, had to wear pantyhose. Remember, women were required to wear.
Yeah, and 2-inch heels, which I never wore heels then. Anyway, but the thing I've really found refreshing about this is it's about the responsibility of all parties. It's not about any one group trying to change to adapt. It's about the onus on understanding the message as it was intended is really important. So just leave you on that thing that Susie said was if you're going to take one thing away, the receiver makes the meaning of the message. And I think that's a really powerful thing to remind ourselves of. I included a link to Susie's bio in the invite that went out today, and I'm sure she'd be happy to connect with any of you on social media or after, and I'm happy to make intros if anyone needs that. But thank you so much, Susie. It's great to see you again, and hopefully we'll see you in person soon and give you a big hug. And thanks everybody for the last few months. These have been fab, and we'll see what happens in September.